Do-jin, is being wheeled through a sterile hospital corridor by his lover, Hyun. Despite the expensive leather of his wheelchair and the presence of his suit-clad guards, he is a ghost, emotionally and physically numb to the world around him. Cynthia Okorie, a Nigerian nurse distraught and rushing, accidentally grazes Do-jin's wrist as she passes. For the first time in 1,460 days, the ghost trapped in Do-jin's body feels a jolt of life. His breath hitches, his eyes widen in profound shock, and his toes curl inside his shoes, a sensation doctors claimed was impossible. Overwhelmed by the sudden fire in his nerves, he grabs his armrest until his knuckles turn white and shouts a rough, desperate order to his men to stop her. Do-jin's men intercept Cynthia, causing her to stumble back in terror and confusion. When she is pulled back toward the wheelchair, her panic turns to fury, and she slaps the mafia boss, the sound echoing through the silent hallway. Instead of the expected retaliation, Do-jin looks at her with wonder, seeing the deep loneliness and desperation in the eyes of this tattooed monster. Cynthia's anger breaks. Moved by a sudden sense of pity, Cynthia kneels on the polished floor and places her hand on Do-jin's knee. This second, intentional touch sends a lightning current up his spine, confirming the healing connection. That night, Do-jin remains awake, his skin still tingling from the encounter. He orders his surveillance network to find her. By the following evening, he learns her identity, Cynthia Okorie, whose father, Maduka, lies in a coma in room 304, the victim of a cleanup order issued by Do-jin's own organization. The morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Do-jin's penthouse, but it felt cold against his skin. He sat motionless in his chair, his gaze fixed on the digital tablet in his lap, while his lead investigator stood in silence. On the screen was the face from the hospital corridor, Cynthia Okorie. The grainy surveillance footage from the hallway didn't do justice to the fire he had seen in her eyes. Yet even the static image made his wrist throb where her fingers had grazed him. For 4 years, he had been a prisoner of his own nerves, a man of iron and ink who felt as hollow as a drum. Now, a single accidental touch had turned his world into a storm of static and heat. "Tell me," Do-jin commanded, his voice a low, dangerous rasp. The investigator cleared his throat, sensing the boss's uncharacteristic intensity. Cynthia Okorie, 28, originally from Nigeria. She's been working as a nurse here in Seoul for 3 years. She's clean, no records, no ties to our rivals. She spends every free hour at Seoul National University Hospital. Room 304, Do-jin's finger traced the screen. Room 304, why? The investigator hesitated, tapping a command to bring up a medical file. Her father, Maduka Okorie. He's been in a persistent vegetative state for 6 months. He was caught in the crossfire of a street war in Itaewon last July. The air in the room seemed to vanish. July, Itaewon. Do-jin closed his eyes, and the memories he had tried to bury surfaced like corpses in a tide. He remembered the smell of rain on hot asphalt and the deafening roar of gunfire that had eventually shattered his spine. He had always known that night was a bloodbath, but he had viewed the casualties as numbers on a ledger. Now, the numbers had a name. They had a daughter with warm hands and a slap that could wake the dead. "It was a cleanup order, sir," the investigator added quietly. "A witness from a rival transaction had to be eliminated. The chaos of the turf war was used as cover." Do-jin felt a sickening realization settle in his chest. He hadn't given that order. He had been too busy bleeding out on the pavement to care. But his organization, the empire he had built with his own blooded hands, had crushed this woman's life while he was losing his own. He was the source of her grief. Every time she wept by that hospital bed, she was mourning a man his people had tried to kill. He looked down at his legs, still useless beneath the fine fabric of his trousers. The spark of life she had given him felt like a curse now. He was a monster who had accidentally tasted heaven, only to find he was the one who had built the gates of her hell. "Watch her," he whispered, his eyes dark with a new, agonizing purpose, "and find out which of my men decided to play God while I was in a coma." To the world, he was the dragon of Seoul, but to the staff of the intensive care unit, he was simply Mr. Hana, wealthy, reclusive patient recovering from a long-term spinal injury. It was a disguise made of half-truths. Do-jin traded his tailored suits for a soft, charcoal gray cardigan, and ordered his guards to remain out of sight, haunting the stairwells like shadows. He didn't need a weapon to infiltrate this ward. He only needed his silence and the chair that had been his cage for 4 years. He found her in room 304. Just as the evening sun began to bleed into a bruised purple across the horizon, Cynthia was sitting by her father's bed, her cornrow braids gathered at the nape of her neck, her head bowed as she whispered words in a language that sounded like music and sorrow combined. Do-jin lingered in the doorway, the motor of his wheelchair humming softly. When she looked up, her eyes were red-rimmed, but the fire he remembered was still there, flickering low. She recognized him instantly, the man from the hallway. "You," she breathed, her voice cautious. "I didn't come to frighten you," Do-jin said, his voice stripped of its usual steel. "I came to apologize for my men. They are overprotective of my condition." Cynthia studied him for a long moment, her gaze falling to his motionless legs and then back to his face. The tension in her shoulders broke. "I shouldn't have slapped you," she admitted, a weary smile touching her lips. "I was just scared. My father, he isn't getting better. I know what it is to be trapped in a body that refuses to listen," Do-jin replied, moving closer until he was parked beside her. It was the most honest thing he had said in years. He looked at Madoka, the man his empire had broken, and felt a crushing weight in his chest. "Tell me about him." For the next hour, the monster and the nurse sat in the dim light of the heart monitor's glow. She told him of a man who loved high-life music and spicy jollof rice. A man who had moved across the world to give his daughter a future. In return, Do-jin spoke of his own accident, painting a picture of a lonely life spent in a gilded tower. They were two orphans of fate, bound by a grief that Cynthia didn't realize they shared. As he reached out to steady a glass of water on the nightstand, his hand brushed hers. That same electric heat surged through him, a violent reminder that he was alive. Cynthia didn't pull away. Instead, she rested her hand over his, her skin warm and grounding. "You have very sad eyes, Mr. Han," she whispered. Do-jin looked at their joined hands, the victim and the villain, and realized that the mercy mask was becoming more real than the man beneath it. He was falling for the one person who had every reason to want him dead. The blue glow of multiple monitors illuminated Do-jin's face, casting long, sharp shadows across the penthouse office. He sat in his chair, no longer the soft Mr. Han from the hospital, but the Dragon of Seoul. Before him, a sequence of encrypted files and recovered dashcam footage from the night of the Itaewon massacre flickered into focus. His eyes, cold and calculating, tracked the movement of a black sedan car that shouldn't have been in that sector. As the footage stabilized, a figure stepped out into the rain of that fateful July night. It was Kang Min-ho, his most trusted lieutenant, the man who currently stood at his right hand. Do-jin watched, his jaw tightening, as Min-ho raised a suppressed pistol and fired into the crowd where Cynthia's father had been standing. There was no crossfire, no accidental tragedy. It was a cold-blooded execution intended to silence a witness who had seen too much of Min-ho's private side dealings. But the betrayal ran deeper. Do-jin rewound the footage, his breath hitching as he saw the second half of the recording. He saw his own car entering the frame minutes later. He saw the flash of an explosive device planted under the asphalt, a trap specifically designed for his motorcade. Min-ho hadn't just destroyed Cynthia's family. He had orchestrated the blast that had shattered Do-jin's spine and left him rotting in a wheelchair for 4 years. The realization hit Do-jin like a physical blow. The man he had treated like a brother had stolen his legs, his life, and his future, all while playing the loyal soldier. Min-ho had allowed Do-jin to live as a paralyzed figurehead, a ghost in a suit, while he quietly siphoned the empire's power for himself. The ghost of July wasn't a memory. It was a living traitor breathing the same air. Do-jin looked down at his hands, which were shaking with a mix of murderous rage and a terrifying, newfound clarity. He finally understood why Cynthia's touch had acted like a lightning rod. She was the living link to the truth he had been too blind to see. He wasn't just a victim of fate. He was a victim of a coup that was still in motion. Every moment he spent playing Mr. Han was a moment Min-ho used to tighten the noose. Do-jin reached for his phone, his voice a low, vibrating growl as he contacted his few remaining loyalists. The time for grieving in the dark was over. If he was going to burn his empire down to save her, he would start with the man who had turned their lives into a wasteland of ash and ink. Park Ha-si-hyun had spent 3 years perfecting the art of being the woman behind the throne. She had pushed Do-jin's wheelchair, managed his moods, and waited patiently for the day his spirit would finally break so she could rule through his name. But lately, the air in the penthouse had changed. Do-jin was no longer a hollow shell. There was a predatory sharpness in his gaze that hadn't been there since before the accident. Her suspicion turned into a cold, hard knot when she checked his private security logs. He had been slipping away to the hospital's intensive care unit, not for his own treatment, but to sit in the dim light of room 304. When she saw the surveillance stills of Do-jin holding Cynthia's hand, Ha-si-hyun felt a rage that burned hotter than any betrayal. It wasn't just the touch. It was the way he looked at the stranger with a raw, human vulnerability he had never once offered her. To Ha-si-hyun, Cynthia was an outsider, a nobody from a world that didn't belong in their hierarchy. Yet she had achieved in a moment what Ha-si-hyun couldn't do in years. She had made him feel. Ha-si-hyun didn't confront him. Instead, she retreated to the shadows of the club basement, where the music was loud enough to drown out a conspiracy. Waiting for her was Kang Min-ho. He looked up from his drink, his eyes narrow and calculating. He knew she had seen the truth. He's compromised, Ha-si-hyun whispered, her voice like the hiss of a viper. She leaned over the table, her minimalist black dress shimmering in the neon light. He's chasing a ghost and a girl who doesn't know he's the one who destroyed her life. He's weak, Min-ho. He's going to hand our empire over to the police just to clear his conscience. Min-ho smiled, a slow, jagged expression. He had already set the trap that broke Do-jin's back. Finishing the job was simply a matter of timing. A dragon who wants to be a man is a liability, he agreed. But if we move against him now, the loyalists will revolt. We need a lever. We have one, Ha-si-hyun replied, her eyes flashing with a cruel brilliance. He thinks that woman is his salvation. Let's show him she's actually his ending. As the two of them shook hands, the alliance of the serpent and the traitor was sealed. Ha-si-hyun felt no remorse. If she couldn't own the dragon of Seoul, she would be the one to ensure he never walked again physically or metaphorically. The plan was simple. Use Cynthia to lure Do-jin into a final, fatal trap, and erase the outsider before she could take anything else away. The hospital room was quieter than usual, the hum of the ventilator providing a rhythmic pulse to the heavy silence. Do-jin sat by Maduka's bed, his charcoal cardigan pushed up slightly as he reached out to adjust the floral arrangement Cynthia had brought earlier. He didn't hear the door swing open, nor did he notice the shadow that fell across the floor until a tray of coffee crashed to the ground. Orins, Cynthia's younger brother, stood in the doorway, his face ashen. His gaze wasn't on the coffee or his sleeping father. It was fixed entirely on Do-jin's exposed forearm. The soft light of the room caught the intricate, dark ink of a dragon's tail coiling upward toward Do-jin's neck, a signature mark known only to those who feared the underworld. Orins, what happened? Cynthia rushed into the room, looking from the shattered cups to her brother. Get away from him, see? Orins hissed, his voice trembling with a mixture of terror and rage. That's him, the dragon of the northern district. I saw that ink on the news when the Itaewon shootings happened. That's the monster of Seoul. Cynthia froze, her gaze dropping to Do-jin's arm. The gentle Mr. Han she had shared her deepest fears with suddenly looked like a stranger. The tattoos weren't just art. They were a roadmap of a violent empire. She stepped back, her heart hammering against her ribs. Is it true? She whispered. Are you Han Do-jin? Do-jin didn't flinch. He slowly pulled his sleeve down, covering the mark of his shame, and looked her in the eye. The mask of the lonely patient had finally shattered. Yes, he said, his voice a low, somber weight. That is my name. You did this, she gasped, gesturing to her father's unresponsive form. You were there that night. You brought this hell into our lives while you sat here pretending to care. Cynthia, listen to me, Do-jin pleaded, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair as if he were trying to force his body to stand. I was there, yes. I was the target of that night's betrayal, but I never ordered the hit on your father. I didn't even know his name until I saw your face in that hallway. Why should I believe a murderer? She spat, hairs of betrayal stinging her eyes. Because I am a prisoner of that night just as much as he is, Do-jin replied, his voice breaking with an honesty he hadn't used in decades. I am the monster, Cynthia, but I am not his monster. I've spent every day since I met you trying to find a way to fix a debt that can never be paid. I didn't come here to hurt you. I came here because you were the only thing that made me feel like a man again. Cynthia looked at his paralyzed legs, then at the father he had helped her pray for. The air was thick with a truth that hurt worse than the lie. She wanted to scream, but all she could do was point to the door, her hand shaking. Leave, she choked out, before I give you a reason to use that power you're so proud of. Do-jin bowed his head, the weight of his sins finally crushing the spark of hope she had ignited. He signaled for his shadows in the hallway, leaving her in the silence of a room that now felt like a tomb. The silence of the penthouse was shattered not by a sound, but by the vibration of a phone against the glass coffee table. Do-jin reached for it, his movements sluggish, his mind still trapped in the hospital room where Cynthia had looked at him with such pure, agonizing loathing. He expected a message from his loyalists or perhaps a cold legal notice from the hospital. Instead, a video file appeared from an untraceable source. He pressed play. The grainy footage showed a dark, industrial space, a warehouse he recognized as one of Minho's primary distribution hubs. In the center of the frame, tied to a rusted metal chair, was Cynthia. Her braids were undone, falling over her face in a curtain of dark hair, and a strip of heavy tape covered her mouth. Beside her stood Si-hyun, her face a mask of elegant cruelty as she leaned down to whisper something into Cynthia's ear before looking directly into the camera. You always did have a weakness for broken things, Do-jin. As Si-hyun's voice came through the speaker, silky and cold. But you chose a broken woman over a loyal queen. That was your final mistake. The camera panned to reveal Minho standing in the shadows behind them, his hand resting casually on his holster. The digital keys, boss, Minho said, his tone devoid of its usual mock respect. The Swiss accounts, the shipping manifests, and the deed to the district. You have 2 hours to transfer the encryption codes to the private server we provided. If the transfer doesn't complete, we'll see if this spark of yours can survive a bullet. The video cut to black, leaving Do-jin's reflection staring back at him from the screen. For a moment, he sat in absolute stillness. The betrayal he had uncovered in the files was now a physical blade at his throat. They weren't just taking his money. They were taking the only person who had ever seen the man beneath the monster. His hands gripped the wheels of his chair so hard the metal groaned. He was a dragon without fire, a king without a kingdom, trapped in a body that had failed him. He looked at the clock on the wall. 2 hours. It would take longer than that for his remaining loyalists to mobilize, and any move by the police would result in Cynthia's immediate execution. He was out of time, out of allies, and out of options. But as he looked at the dark screen where Cynthia's defiant eyes had last been visible, he felt a familiar, violent heat rising from the base of his spine. If they wanted the dragon, he would give them the dragon, but not the one who sat in a chair and waited for the end. He reached for his phone and dialed a number he had vowed never to call, his private physician's emergency line. The neural enhancer, Do-jin whispered into the receiver, his eyes burning with a terrifying light. Bring the fire cocktail to the penthouse, now. I don't care if it kills me. I'm going to stand up. The air in the penthouse felt like a tomb as Dr. Choi opened the velvet-lined case, revealing a single syringe filled with a shimmering, amber liquid. The doctor's hands shook. This isn't medicine, Do-jin. It's a chemical overload. It will force your synapses to fire through the scar tissue by burning out the receptors. You'll have 60 minutes of mobility, maybe less. After that, the nervous system collapse could be fatal. Do-jin looked at the wheelchair that had been his throne and his cage, then at the frozen image of Cynthia on his phone. He didn't hesitate. He stripped off the charcoal cardigan, exposing the ink-stained muscle of his chest and the jagged scar on his spine. Inject it, he commanded, his voice as cold as a winter sea. Sir, the pain will be. I've lived in a frozen hell for 4 years, Do-jin interrupted, his eyes locking onto the doctor's with a terrifying intensity. I've felt my soul rot while my enemies grew fat on my silence. I'd rather die standing than live another minute in this chair while she suffers because of my name. As the needle pierced the base of his neck, the world turned white. It wasn't a gradual return of feeling. It was a violent, screaming invasion of fire. Do-jin's back arched as the fire cocktail tore through his dormant nerves. His muscles, long withered by atrophy, began to spasm and seize. He fell from the chair, hitting the hardwood floor with a dull thud. For a moment, he lay there, gasping, his vision swimming in red. Then, his fingers twitched. He pressed his palms against the floor. With a guttural roar that tore from his throat, he pushed. His legs, once dead weight, shook with the effort of supporting his mass. He rose slowly, like a rusted machine grinding back to life, until he stood tall for the first time in 1,460 days. The pain was a physical weight, a white-hot current vibrating through his bones, but he welcomed it. It meant he was no longer a ghost. He looked at his reflection in the floor-to-ceiling glass, a tattooed monster reborn in fire. He reached for the heavy black overcoat his guards held out, draped it over his shoulders, and checked the weight of the pistol at his small of back. He didn't need the wheelchair anymore. He walked toward the elevator, each step a deliberate victory over the paralysis that had defined him. He had one hour to be the man Cynthia thought he was, and the monster his enemies feared. The burning hour had begun, and by the time it ended, Seoul would know that the dragon had finally woken up. The warehouse stood like a rusted titan against the docks, its skeletal frame shivering under the lash of a coastal rain. Inside, Minho paced near the center of the floor, his eyes darting to the heavy steel doors. Hyun stood by Cynthia's chair, checking her watch with a smirk of triumph. "He's not coming, Minho. He's probably staring at the codes, realizing his empire's worth more than a girl he barely knows." Then, the heavy doors didn't just open, they groaned as they were kicked wide. A silhouette emerged from the mist, tall and terrifyingly upright. The rhythmic thud-clack of footsteps echoed through the cavernous space, as the figure stepped into the harsh glare of the overhead lights. Hyun let out a strangled gasp. It was Do-jin. He wasn't in the chair. He was walking, his heavy black overcoat billowing behind him, his eyes burning with a lethal, amber light. "Impossible," Minho whispered, his hand fumbling for his weapon. "You're a cripple." Do-jin didn't waste breath on words. The fire cocktail was a roaring furnace in his veins, granting him a speed that defied his wasted muscles. When the first three guards raised their rifles, Do-jin was already moving. He was a blur of ink and violence, his movements jagged but precise. He disarmed the first man with a sickening crack of bone and used the second as a shield, his own pistol barking twice as he cleared a path toward the center of the room. The pain was a white-hot scream behind his ribs, but he pushed through it, his focus locked entirely on Cynthia's terrified eyes. "Kill him," Minho roared, diving behind a stack of shipping crates. A hail of gunfire erupted, the bullets chewing into the concrete pillars around Do-jin. He didn't flinch. As the crossfire tightened, he lunged across the open floor, throwing his body over Cynthia's just as a spray of lead shattered the chair she was tied to. He felt the hot bite of a bullet tear through the meat of his shoulder, and another graze his thigh, but he didn't move. He became a wall of tattooed muscle and Kevlar, shielding her from the shards of wood and metal. "I've got you," he rasped into her ear, his voice thick with blood and the strain of his failing nerves. With a final, desperate surge of strength, Do-jin rolled, firing a blind, suppressed volley that forced Minho's shooters into cover. He sliced through Cynthia's bindings with a hidden blade, his hands trembling as the amber liquid in his system began to flicker out. He could feel the numbness returning, a cold tide rising from his feet, but he forced himself back up one last time. He stood between Cynthia and the world, a dying dragon ready to burn everything down to ensure she saw the morning sun. The sirens wailed in the distance. A choir of the warehouse stood like a rusted titan against the docks, its skeletal frame shivering under the lash of a coastal rain. Inside, Minho paced near the center of the floor, his eyes darting to the heavy steel doors. Hyun stood by Cynthia's chair, checking her watch with a smirk of triumph. "He's not coming, Minho. He's probably staring at the codes, realizing his empire's worth more than a girl he barely knows." Then, the heavy doors didn't just open, they groaned as they were kicked wide. A silhouette emerged from the mist, tall and terrifyingly upright. The rhythmic thud-clack of footsteps echoed through the cavernous space, as the figure stepped into the harsh glare of the overhead lights. Hyun let out a strangled gasp. It was Do-jin. He wasn't in the chair. He was walking, his heavy black overcoat billowing behind him, his eyes burning with a lethal, amber light. Impossible, Minho whispered, his hand fumbling for his weapon. You're a cripple. Do-jin didn't waste breath on words. The fire cocktail was a roaring furnace in his veins, granting him a speed that defied his wasted muscles. When the first 3 guards raised their rifles, Do-jin was already moving. He was a blur of ink and violence, his movements jagged but precise. He disarmed the first man with a sickening crack of bone and used the second as a shield, his own pistol barking twice as he cleared a path toward the center of the room. The pain was a white-hot scream behind his ribs, but he pushed through it, his focus locked entirely on Cynthia's terrified eyes. Kill him, Minho roared, diving behind a stack of shipping crates. A hail of gunfire erupted, the bullets chewing into the concrete pillars around Do-jin. He didn't flinch. As the crossfire tightened, he lunged across the open floor, throwing his body over Cynthia's just as a spray of lead shattered the chair she was tied to. He felt the hot bite of a bullet tear through the meat of his shoulder, and another graze his thigh, but he didn't move. He became a wall of tattooed muscle and Kevlar, shielding her from the shards of wood and metal. I've got you, he rasped into her ear, his voice thick with blood and the strain of his failing nerves. With a final, desperate surge of strength, Do-jin rolled, firing a blind, suppressed volley that forced Minho's shooters into cover. He sliced through Cynthia's bindings with a hidden blade, his hands trembling as the amber liquid in his system began to flicker out. He could feel the numbness returning, a cold tide rising from his feet, but he forced himself back up one last time. He stood between Cynthia and the world, a dying dragon ready to burn everything down to ensure she saw the morning sun. Approaching judgment that signaled the end of the dragon's reign. As the warehouse lights flickered and the smoke of the firefight settled, Do-jin felt the fire in his veins finally extinguish. The cold, familiar numbness surged back, claiming his legs and dragging him toward the floor. He collapsed against a crate, his body broken and bleeding, but his eyes remained fixed on Cynthia. Go, he rasped, shoving a thick manila envelope and a set of keys toward her. My private transport is waiting at the rear. There is a clinic in the southern provinces and traceable, world class. Your father is being moved there now. I've paid for 10 years of care. He'll be safe. Cynthia gripped the envelope, her eyes searching his. What about you? I'm a ghost, Cynthia. I was dead long before I met you, he said, the shadow of a smile touching his lips as the first blue and red light splashed against the warehouse windows. This is how it ends. But as the police breached the front doors, Cynthia didn't run. She looked at the man who had traded his life to stand for her, the monster who had bled to shield her from a fate he had inadvertently caused. She saw the Mr. Han who had listened to her grief in the dark. Not today, she whispered. With a strength born of desperation, she hauled his heavy, uncooperative frame onto a motorized loading cart, covering him with his discarded black overcoat. As the authorities swarmed the main floor to apprehend Minho and Se-hyun, Cynthia navigated the labyrinth of shipping containers, slipping through a side loading dock into the rainy night. Hours later, the Seoul skyline was a receding memory in the rearview mirror. They were in a nondescript SUV, heading south toward the coast. Do-jin lay in the back seat, his legs once again silent weight, but his hand was firmly clasped in hers. He had dismantled his empire in a single hour of fire, trading his crown for a fugitive's vow. You have nothing left, he said quietly, looking at her profile in the dim light of the dashboard. No home, no job. You're running with a dead man. Cynthia squeezed his hand, the warmth of her skin grounding him more than any drug ever could. You gave my father a chance, and you gave me the truth. I'm not running from anything, Do-jin. I'm running towards something. The dragon of Seoul was gone, buried under the ash of the warehouse. In his place was a man with a scarred spine and a heart that finally beat for itself. As the sun began to peek over the horizon, painting the road in shades of gold, Do-jin realized he was no longer a boss, a prisoner, or a ghost. He was simply hers. If you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our dramatic love stories. Comment below and let's continue with this journey.